Today, I want to slow down and explore the book of Job in a way that many people never do. Not through later church doctrine, not through systematic theology layered onto the text centuries afterward, and not through the usual simplified moral reading that says Job is just about suffering, patience, and faith. I want to ask a deeper question. What if the book of Job preserves traces of an ancient worldview that reaches back into a much older understanding of reality? What if this text is carrying echoes from a time before later Yahweh monotheism fully took shape? And what if, when we read Job carefully, we are not just reading a religious poem, but a memory of a world in which human beings believed they were being governed by powers beyond themselves? That is the question. Because Job is one of the strangest books in the Hebrew Bible. It does not feel like Deuteronomy. It does not sound like the covenant-centered history of Israel. It is not rooted in Jerusalem, temple ritual, or national identity. It is set in the land of Uz, outside Judea, outside the usual center of Hebrew religious life, and it presents a world that feels older, darker, and more cosmic. When you step into Job, you are entering a universe where multiple powerful beings exist, where councils are held in heaven, where human suffering is discussed from above, and where forces beyond man seem to govern, test, and interfere in earthly life with very little empathy. That is not a small thing. So the first place to begin is with the language of Job itself. One of the most noticeable features in the book is the repeated use of Eloah. That matters. Eloah is the singular form related to Elohim, and in Job it appears with unusual frequency compared to many other biblical books. That raises questions. Why does this book prefer this form so often? Does it preserve an older layer of Hebrew belief? Does it reflect a more ancient way of speaking about divine power? Or does it preserve a memory from a period when the heavens were understood as populated by many beings, even if one was supreme? These are the kinds of questions we should be asking when we read slowly. Then we come to Job chapter 1, and the text becomes even more striking. The sons of God appear, Yahweh is present, and the Satan appears among them. This is not a lonely, abstract, monotheistic heaven. This is a council scene, a gathering, a structured assembly of superhuman beings. And in that scene, Job's life is discussed almost like a matter on the table. His faithfulness is not honored with protection. Instead, it becomes the basis for a test. That should disturb us, because the opening of Job does not present a world where humans are tenderly cared for by a simple, singular moral order. It presents a world where higher beings speak, decide, observe, and permit suffering from above. That forces us to ask hard questions about hierarchy, power, and responsibility. Who are these beings? What exactly is this council? And why is humanity portrayed as so vulnerable beneath it? What makes this even more important is that Job is not alone. This council imagery appears elsewhere in the Bible too. In Deuteronomy 32, we find language that many scholars connect to a division of nations among heavenly beings. In Psalm 82, God stands in the divine assembly among other powers. In Psalm 89, we again see the language of the council of the holy ones. And in 1 Kings 22, the prophet Micaiah describes seeing Yahweh enthroned with the host of heaven standing around him, participating in deliberation. That is a pattern, and once you see that pattern, it becomes difficult to keep reading the Bible as though it emerged in total isolation from the wider ancient world. Because it did not. When these passages are read alongside Mesopotamian and Ugaritic literature, especially the material discovered at Ras Shamra, we begin to see that the heavens in the ancient world were often imagined as populated, not empty, not abstract, populated. The divine realm was understood as structured, layered, inhabited, and ruled. And that matters because Job fits that world. It belongs to that conversation far more than many later readers are willing to admit. Now let's move to one of the most fascinating parts of Job, Leviathan, in chapter 41. This being is not described like an ordinary animal. The language is too extreme, too exalted, too mythic. Leviathan is described as beyond human capture. Weapons do not master it. Fear surrounds it. Its appearance inspires awe. Its power exceeds normal categories. And the text culminates by portraying it as a ruler over others. This is why reducing Leviathan to just a crocodile has always felt too small. The language of Job 41 is doing something much bigger than zoology. Leviathan is presented as a being of terrifying superiority, a chaos being, a creature or entity beyond ordinary man, something exalted, dangerous, and untouchable. And when we compare this description to the wider ancient Near East, the parallels become even stronger. Across ancient literature, we find chaos monster traditions again and again. Great beings of the deep, serpentine powers, forces connected to the sea, disorder, kingship, and cosmic struggle. So whether one reads Leviathan as mythic, symbolic, or something remembered through distorted tradition, the point remains the same. Job is operating in a world full of more than human powers. And that brings us to Yahweh. Job is deeply important because it seems to stand in a transitional place in how Yahweh is portrayed. In earlier biblical traditions, Yahweh appears in embodied ways. He walks. He speaks face to face. He descends. He appears in fire, smoke, storm, and whirlwind. He eats. He moves through space in ways that are vivid and concrete. In Job, some of that is still there. Yahweh still speaks. Yahweh still appears in the storm. Yahweh still engages directly, audibly, and dramatically. And yet, there is also movement, a shift. The portrayal begins to lean toward something that later theology will continue to develop, a more elevated, more distant, more transcendent conception. That makes Job incredibly important. It feels like a book preserving older cosmic imagery while also standing on the edge of a later theological world. And that is exactly why it is worth reading so carefully. Because if Job preserves older material, older imagery, older assumptions about a populated heaven and a council of powers, then we may be looking at a surviving fragment of a worldview in which human beings believed they were not alone and not fully in control of their condition. They believed they were ruled over, watched, tested, governed, perhaps even exploited or toyed with by beings above them. Now, this is where some people will stop and others will lean in, because once you recognize that worldview, another question begins to emerge. Could some of these ancient memories, preserved in texts like Job and echoed across surrounding cultures, represent more than myth in the modern dismissive sense? Could they be distorted memories of real encounters with non-human intelligences in the deep past? This is where the idea of paleocontact comes into the conversation. Not as doctrine, not as something the text proves directly, and not as a claim that can simply be declared as settled fact, but as a possibility, as a lens, as a question worth sitting with. Because if ancient humans consistently described the heavens as populated, if they repeatedly spoke of councils of powers, if they remembered beings descending, ruling, speaking, and shaping human affairs, and if those patterns appear not only in the Bible, but across the literature of the ancient Near East, then at the very least we are dealing with a very old and very widespread memory structure. What caused that memory structure? Was it symbolic imagination? Was it religious language for natural and political forces? Was it mythology in the literary sense? Or could there be, somewhere behind the symbolism and the redaction and the theological polishing, traces of contact with intelligences that early humanity experienced as gods? That is the deeper question. And the Book of Job does not answer it for us in a neat way, but it does preserve the atmosphere of such a world where the heavens are not empty, a world where powerful beings gather, a world where human lives are affected from above, a world where monstrous non-human powers like Leviathan are part of the structure of reality. and a world where the divine is still close enough to speak in storms, yet distant enough to leave man trembling in confusion. So maybe Job is not just a book about suffering. Maybe it is also a witness to an ancient consciousness, a witness to a world far older than later theological systems, a witness to the possibility that humanity once understood itself as living beneath a populated and dangerous cosmos. And if that is true, then Job is far stranger than most people have been told. It is not just comforting, it is not just offensive, it is not just philosophical, it is a doorway into the deep past. And maybe, just maybe, a doorway into memories that later religion tried to contain, reinterpret, or spiritualize. That does not mean paleocontact is proven, but it does mean the text leaves open questions that many modern readers are too quick to shut down. And maybe the most honest thing we can do is let those questions remain alive. So as we close this module, I want to leave you with a few things to reflect on. What are your thoughts on the book of Job? Is it a book you have read before? How do you deal with the moral take-home of Job as it exists today, with all its layers of translation, redaction, and interpretation? Is Job an offensive book to you, or a comforting one? Do you read the Bible in a bubble, isolated from the wider world of ancient literature? Or have you begun to connect it to the broader human memory of the ancient world? And finally, what does it mean for you if Job reflects a time when humans believed they were governed by non-human beings? That is where I want to leave it. Not with easy answers, but with the text, with the questions, and with the possibility that beneath the surface of Job, something very ancient is still speaking.